get you one way or another. I'm gonna win ya. I'm gonna get you one way or another. I'm gonna see ya. I'm gonna meet you one day. Maybe next week I'm gonna meet ya. I'll meet ya. I will drive past your house, and if the lights are all down, I'll see who's around.
Welcome back. We're thankful you're joining us again as we explore the 7 deadly sins. Today we look at the second of the deadly sins, which we see growing in the life of Moses. And that's surprising because Moses is the greatest hero, the greatest leader in the history of the Hebrew people. In fact, there's no bigger character in all of the Old Testament than Moses. And yet by the time we reach the 20th chapter of the book of Numbers, we see how one particular sin has taken over the life of the greatest leader in the history of God's people. By the time we reach the 20th chapter, the Hebrew people turn to Moses with a problem. This isn't surprising. For 40 years, the Hebrew people have been asking Moses to solve their problems, whether there's a lack of food, a lack of water, a lack of leadership. They always turn to Moses. Moses turns to God. God delivers the Hebrew people. It's the same story over and over again in a variety of ways. Only this time it's a little more dramatic. The Hebrew people come to Moses and they say, Moses, it would have been better for our ancestors to have died in Egypt than for us to face this crisis. Think about what they're saying. It would have been better for mom and dad, for grandma and grandpa to have died as slaves in the land of Egypt. So we would not have been born because that would have been better than facing this crisis. Naturally, you're wondering what this crisis is. The Hebrew people explained to Moses, we don't have enough water. Now, it's not that they are thirsty. That's not the problem. They have plenty of water to drink. The Hebrew people tell Moses, and perhaps the most pathetic words ever uttered in human history, they say, Moses, we don't have enough water to grow pomegranates. Think about that. One generation of the Hebrew people is worried about dying as slaves in the land of Egypt. The next group is worried about the fruit selection at the local market. This is not even comparing apples to oranges. This is comparing death and slavery to pomegranates. You understand why Moses is irritated by this. He turns to God because that's his habit. God says to Moses, summon the Hebrew people, gather everyone together, speak to a rock. I'm going to pour water from the rock. So Moses follows what God says. He summons the Hebrew people, but he just can't help himself. The Hebrew people are gathered there. He looks at them, he looks at the rock, but he turns back to the Hebrew people and he lets them have it. You sinners, he screams. You're a bunch of rebels. Do you want me to pour water from this rock? And instead of speaking to the rock, in this fit of rage, Moses takes his staff, and not once but twice, he just hits that rock as hard as he possibly can. Next thing you know, water pours forth from the rock. The Hebrew people are amazed. There's no mention in the Bible about how the pomegranate harvest was the following year. But we are told how God responds to Moses. God says, Moses, because you did not trust me, you will not be entering the promised land. The promised land, as in for 40 years, the place that Moses was leading the Hebrew people, as in the land of Israel, as in right over there. Moses has been marching through the wilderness for 4 decades. All that he has to do is lead the Hebrew people through the Jordan River, and they're going to be there. Every dream Moses has had for 4 decades, it's about reaching the promised land. And now God says, Moses, you're not going. You are done leading the Hebrew people. Now you may think this is an overreaction on the part of God. If you do, you're in good company, or in the very least, you're in my company. But friends, God knows something about the sin of Moses that you and I perhaps do not. The sin of Moses is the sin of wrath. And God knows how truly destructive wrath is. Wrath is one of those sins that when we know it when we see it. When suddenly it just erupts. someone grows angry, whether it's because of jealousy or shame, whatever emotion is that's been pent out, all of a sudden it comes out in this uncontrolled rage. That's wrath. And when it happens, we know how destructive that is to a personal relationship. We know how uncomfortable that makes others in the community feel. Now, most of the time, the real insidious thing about wrath is, as destructive as it is, we think we can contain it. We think that if it's one little weed growing in the corner of our lives, it's fine. As long as we avoid that one subject, whether it's in our life or the life of others. Now, for some people, we know, we just don't talk about politics with your uncle and you'll be fine. Don't talk with your mother about how work is going and it'll be fine. Don't talk with, one of your buddies about the 98 Vikings and he'll be just fine. But if those subjects come up, wrath comes pouring out. But if we just avoid those topics, we lie to ourselves, we say, it'll be fine. But friends, that's not how wrath works. Wrath isn't just destructive. Wrath is also habitual. It wants to grow. If you get upset about politics, if you feel yourself growing into a rage over some political issue, what eventually happens is that rage gets passed on to work or to sports or to other subjects in life. And what eventually happens, and we've all seen this, is someone with a short fuse, maybe it's a middle-aged man who erupts over this topic or this topic. Eventually, that fuse is so short, he erupts over everything. And when that happens, what happens to the relationships around him? People eventually begin to avoid him. Eventually, those relationships that are near and dear to him are frayed to the point of becoming non-existent. That's the power of wrath. And God knows that when Moses becomes susceptible to this, it's not that God doesn't love Moses. He just knows that Moses is done, because that's how destructive this sin is in the life of a community. Thankfully, God gives us a virtue, a gift that is stronger than the sin of wrath. It is the virtue of compassion. Compassion is that instead of allowing anger to pour out as we sit in judgment upon others, compassion is that ability, that willingness to listen to their story. Maybe not to agree with them, but to listen with empathy, to see others as brothers and sisters rather than as enemies. This has the capacity to heal us. This has the capacity to heal communities. I know compassion can do this because I witnessed this a couple of years ago. A couple years ago in my hometown of Montezuma, Iowa, the biggest news story was the tragic death of a young woman named Molly. Molly lived about 8 miles away in a neighboring community. At the time, she was a student at the University of Iowa. She was tragically killed. She was killed by a man who was mentally ill, who was an illegal immigrant to the United States. Her death, let me say this very clearly, was evil, was an act of evil. But what happened afterwards, all of the media events that transpired afterwards, it was evil in a different sort of way. And what I witnessed, because I followed this story closely, is how people from all sorts of different perspectives tried to take this young woman's story and co-opt it. They wanted to talk about mental health, or they wanted to talk about illegal immigration, or they wanted to talk about this and that and all these subjects, and they kept using her as kind of the poster child, if you will, that if you just agree with them, then this wouldn't have happened. And as I listened to this unfold night after night, day after day, I could feel the rage growing within me. And I even wondered what would have happened if heaven forbid, I were a member of that family. How would I respond? It would have been anger, to be sure, probably righteous anger, bordering on wrath, but I would have let people in the world, people in the media who were using my dear loved one's story to further their own agendas, I would have been quick to let them have it. But instead, her family responded with compassion over and over again. In fact, her father penned this beautiful letter to the Des Moines Register that was shared with everyone in the state of Iowa about how we should listen rather than shout, how we should turn to compassion instead of hatred, how we should build bridges instead of walls. He spoke with a compassion that was a gift. It It was a gift for the world because I know what it did for people that I hold near and dear. People who in the midst of that situation, who were so filled with rage, they were ready to just erupt. And instead, thanks to Molly's family and to their response of compassion, I saw the healing that happened in those that I hold dear. People of God, compassion is stronger than wrath. Whatever wrath has destroyed in your life, compassion has the ability to renew and recreate whatever wrath has destroyed. So people of God, we invite you now to turn to one another, have a conversation about perhaps the ways in which wrath tempts you to give into it, but more importantly, talk about the ways in which compassion has transformed you and maybe the lives of the people you love the most. Again, thanks for joining us.
Trick you one way or another. I'm gonna lose you. I'm gonna give you the slip. I'll walk down the mall, stand over by the wall where I can see it all. Find out who you call, lead you to the supermarket, check out some specials and wrap food. Get lost in the crowd, one way or another. I'm gonna get you, I'll get you, I'll get you, get you one way.